Alright, kind of a response video to Hythloday on this physics subject. I wanted to make another video anyway, just because the last video was a little noisy. And this one might be too. So what I will do is, before I publish this video, I will write down the key points. To get directly to his direct question, which was on entanglement. Yeah, I'm not very interested in entanglement as a concept. I don't think it's a real phenomenon. I think it's a manifestation of, again, an inability to create laboratory instruments capable of seeing photons or even electrons for that matter, and that the mode of detection and is just not suitable. It's creating the effect. It's not detecting effect. It's creating effect. I'll go back to the Feynman argument that light does one thing. It goes from point A to point B in a straight line. That's what photons do at the speed of light. They don't have any complex function. They certainly don't carry anything besides maybe polarization and their frequency, and that's it. There's nothing. They're the crude element. The complex element is the electron, and it's the relationship between photons and electrons. The fact that electrons produce photons and absorb photons. That is the origin of the quantum mechanical effect, and it is in the complexity of the electron's arrangement to an atom, I would say even more specifically, that creates any kind of wave function or any other kind of manifestation of distortion in a photon's traveling from point A to point B. It travels, how it travels from point A to point B as it interacts with an electron is a predictable product, and any quantum effect is just the effect of the condition of the electron with which the photon interacted. And condition can mean a lot of things about what orbit the electron was in the atom, the energy state of the electron itself, its condition, and what place in that orbit it was at the time it interacted with the photon. All these things will decide what the photon will do as it interacts with the electron. So anyway, but yeah, I don't see any reason to invent some idea of faster than light attachments or communication and then create the catch of some hidden intermediary through which this communication goes through, and therefore we can never use this faster than light method of communication. We could never access it. I just think I think there's a reason why we can't access it, and that is because it doesn't exist. So anyway, to my point, to the part of the physics I'd like to get to, and I have to write a paper on this, so this is going to be part of that process. So I would say that my first contention is that all matter is made out of light, and that's all there is. There's photons, or their constituent elements, moving at the speed of light, and there is nothing else. And the reason why you can't move matter faster than light, or you can't move matter to the speed of light, is because the matter is already moving at the speed of light. The constituent parts are already going the speed of light, and they're just doing it in different directions. And anytime you accelerate matter, you just degrade the structure of the matter, and eventually, in like atomic accelerators, for example, any heavy particle they accelerate does not hit the target as that particle. It hits the target as raw energy, as photons moving all in the same direction. It's a deconstructor. It deconstructs matter. It's an atom smasher. That's what they were called, and that's what they are. They're an atom degrader. The atom is already destroyed before it hits the target. Before the target atoms are hit, the matter that will be hitting them has already been destroyed. Because again, all the structure is in the orbits of the photons. So the photons are built into electrons, and the interesting argument is the space argument. Which one, like when you get into time dilation, you know, these arguments about even what gravity is created by, what's creating the flow, is the space itself being stretched, so to speak? Is it being distorted? And I think there's room for an argument there, you know, because both, you could go with either a distortion of the matter or a distortion of the space and answer a lot of these questions. And it is ultimately an interesting question. I suppose my problem with it is this idea of where does the flow go. So if it was a river flowing into a hole, a drain, you'd still have to explain the drain. You know, how can the space be eaten and yet the space isn't released, you know, with any impact? You know, it's gathered very slowly. How come there's no impact to its quick release? You could almost argue. There's no evidence of that anyway, because that would be, in a sense, a new form of energy. And the fact that it has no energy potential built into it, it doesn't add energy to the system besides the mass that is already the definition of the energy, which is the possession of the material substance that the thing's made out of. There's no extra energy created by gravity. You know, that, you know, it just leaves a little bit of a continuity problem. But I'm thinking, you know, what we do know about photons is the shape problem. So we do know there appears to be a shape thing. You know, the idea of polarization. You know, that they can be in this different configuration as they're facing the world. And that creates an interesting scenario where you could argue that the space they occupy changes depending on which way their position is. You know, if they were if you flatten the board and they were in one position, they would be fat. You know, they'd have a fat appearance, and if they're in the other position, they would have a thin appearance. And that this theoretically could create the illusion of a pressure in the rest of the checkerboard. So if you imagine this is just a checkerboard that goes forever, you know, in 3 dimensions, the thin one would be creating pressure on this space to become bigger space, right? The space on either side would become bigger space because of the narrowness, and on the fat side it would be compressed space. So this space would be moving in the opposite direction, you know, as, you know, to reflect the compression. And this might have something to do with magnetism, it might have something to do with the electromagnetic effect. So it might be useful to use this idea of space. I also find it useful, so to get to the electron. So I'm saying, okay, to start off with just light, and all matter is light, and then light's in configurations, and I don't think we have to worry about neutrons and protons and all the rest of the stuff that are tying atoms together. I think the electron is the most important element, and I'm arguing that the electron is basically photons, a string of photons, many photons, and that the string of photons is in a double helix. And so this would allow the spin of the helix would allow for a change in speed. So an electron traveling in a direction, its speed would be dependent on how fast it was spinning, because this would add more space that the photons would be consuming or riding through per a segment of time. So the distance, this line, the distance of this line as a straight line would change depending on how fast it is spinning. You know, how much space it is spinning through would be decided by how fast it's spinning. So the slower it's spinning, the faster it would be moving, and the faster it's spinning, the slower it would be moving. So that gives you a variable speed electron. And then the electron would also be in a configuration in an atom. So this is a free electron. When an electron is liberated, this would be its configuration. And this is again made up of these pieces of light that may be interlocked based on their polarization, based on a lot of different things. So that I haven't explained yet. And again, that will relate to this idea of what's eating the space. Okay, so anyway, so the third postulate is that the electrons can be configured, when they're captured by atoms in a orbit, and this orbit might have an actual direct string dictating its function, where it's directly tied to the nucleus, and but because of some magnetic effect or some space occupying effect, there is a gap in the electron, and it is through this gap that space is eating. So you can imagine that it will always consume a little bit more space with each rotation through the existence of that gap. So with that gap, it almost creates a spring or a screw effect, and it will screw its way through space. Now you could use this idea to say that the electron, if it's not allowed, if the atom is stationary, if it can't move, it's frozen in a solid and doesn't have much liberation, you could argue that with every rotation this electron would be trying to eat space. It would be consuming space. Space would have to stretch, and it would be almost like the black hole effect or the gravity well effect. It would be pulling space in because it's eating it. It's eating it with every rotation. It's eating a Planck constant or some portion of the checkerboard. So if you vision the checkerboard, I probably should make a whole bunch of checkerboard paper, or find some way to illustrate that. But obviously it would distort the space as it stretches it, and so each ones of this space would just keep getting stretched. So you can imagine that as these squares get stretched or compressed, it would create the illusion of acceleration, because the amount of distance traveled is greater or less than the square difference is the same number of squares will oblige you to travel more distance or less distance, and that creates the idea of time dilation and these other effects. My argument is that I think what defeats that as an idea is first this problem of where does the space go. I mean, does it just stay compressed in the nucleus or something? I mean, where does this extra space you're pulling in go? Which creates a problem. Where's the drain go? And I say it doesn't really solve the problem of the acceleration of a body through space. So when you create acceleration in something in space, and now it's got free momentum. So it's moving in a direction. It has no acceleration anymore, but it's just moving in a direction in space. Why would it be moving? Would the space in front of it be stretched, and so the space in front of it is stretched, and so it's eating stretched space, as in this argument, and so it's biting off more space than actually exists, or compressed space, however the metaphor works best, but it's eating space that is of a different thickness in front of it than it is behind it. So the space in front of it, the checkerboard is smaller than the space behind it where it's wider. And so therefore it ends up eating space in this direction because the squares are smaller in this direction, so it eats more squares, more distance. And so it moves it moves in a direction. Now my problem with that is that there's no evidence in when bodies interact with each other of that force or that stretched space having any effect on the other body. The acceleration of this body doesn't mean anything to this body until they're gravitationally influenced with each other, or electromagnetically or statically. But there needs to be some other connection. The space itself, this body will have it will not detect any pressure moving in front of this body, or one behind it for that matter. So then the space change would have to be limited to a very narrow space right on the edge of the body. And so I just say that doesn't really provide a good answer. So I guess my answer is that the space is rigid, and what changes is the orientation of these electrons. So these electrons change their position, and so instead of where stationary matter would have zillions of these things, but there would be one, you could just draw them simply and say there'd be one pointing down, and then there would be an up one, okay, and then there'd be a right one. Let's see, right would be, well, yeah, I could do it this way, okay, and then there'd be a left one. So you could argue that in balance there was force going in these four directions. There was force going this way that balanced the force going that way, and force going down that balanced the force going up. And obviously there'd be directions in all directions and zillions of these things, but when something was stationary, it would mean that all the orbitals had a net balance in the sense that they were eating space. Okay, that little overhang, the overhangs, when added up, the overhangs would all balance each other out in terms of the net disposition to move. And that what changes when acceleration, when something bangs into this and pushes these atoms, is that it obliges atoms to change their position, because they can't move faster than the electrons can't move faster. The pieces inside the electron cannot move faster than the speed of light. So if this one is pushed and it's already moving in this direction, and you push it in this direction, it can't go faster. So what must happen is it must go slower on the down cycle. So the entire structure must be moved. And so the same thing could be argued that if it was on this line, it would move to this line, or move to this line, or move to this line. It would change its angle proportional to the impact. So the more aggressive the impact, the more substantial the change in its directionality. And that's obliged by the fact that it can't go, that light can't move faster than the speed of light. So therefore the angle of the pitch of the orbit has to change, the pitch of the orbit has to change, or the entire orbit has to be moved. So you either have to change the pitch of the orbit, or you have to change the entire orbit to create this, to allow for the force to have its impact, without making the photons move, the photons moving in the same direction as the force is being applied. They can't go faster than the speed of light, so all of that force has to be realized in a change in position. So the object's orbits, the atoms, will be changed in their structural position by an equal amount to the proportion of net energy moving in the same direction as the force being applied. And that's why there's a maintenance of that momentum, is because once you change those positions, they're not going to be changed again until some other force, some other impact, some other thing changes them. So once you've moved the atom's position, they can still vibrate in that place, they can still have that net influence, there's still a lot of noise or heat inside of the atoms, but the change in its force, the force did structurally change positions, and those positions can't get rechanged unless another force causes a rechange. Yeah, pretty much. But obviously it gets, this all gets quite complex. The other issue I was thinking about on a micro scale, but I won't put this, but those are the three important, the things I'm pretty firm on, is first this idea that all matter is light, that is, E equals M. It's a literal truth. Matter is energy, and light is energy. Anything with energy has to have light in it, photons. Again, I'm using light as a word for photons, anything part of the electromagnetic scale. And that the electrons have this configuration that is made of light, and that the this configuration, like this might be light, the bars that might hold it together would be light of a specific frequency. And that in orbits, the electron becomes a hook. It has a capacity not only to hook onto other electrons, through this mechanism of this opening. So once they're hooked, they can't easily become unhooked. Once they're caught in each other, it's difficult to pull them apart, and that's why you need a certain amount of energy to push them together, and you need a certain amount of energy to pull them apart, is because you have to bend this, you have to open this opening. You have to have the opening in the right position for them to be taken apart. And that requires energy in. But the other thing I did want to get to was that the idea of two photons traveling at each other, and there's two ways to say what would happen if this ever does happen. And I guess my first argument would be that yes, you have this two different angles that they would take off at. They would have some sort of change in their path. You could say that the checkerboard is so fine, that the squares are so tiny and there's so many of them that it never really happens that two photons could ever do that, just because of the number of, just how small the Planck constants are, how small the squares are that these photons are traveling on. But we could also just have a rule, and the rule could be that if you have a checkerboard and a photon is occupying a space, and every Planck constant of time, like I agree with I also originally speculated the idea of a clock speed, that the universe is running on a clock speed, and that it's frozen every moment of time, and that would certainly be consistent with Einstein's argument why you can't accelerate, why light has no acceleration from the object it's produced from. But I think more functionally, the explanation for that is that when light is released, it's just that, it's released. Light isn't created by electrons, it's merely released. So there is there's no momentum, because the light's already moving the speed of light, and it's just being released from a gravitational, quote-unquote, a force holding it together, a force that I think is probably made out of photons also, but regardless. A string holding it, and it's released. The string lets it loose, and it still just travels at the speed of light, so there is no issue. But my argument would be, so say if a space is occupied, we could argue that the rule is no two things can occupy the same space. So the photon, if a photon was coming in this direction towards that space, that it would have to take this neighboring space, and that the only time it can't do that is if the photon is in fact an electron or a string of photons, and therefore it will crash, and there will be incident from crashing. So it would photons would go around each other as individual photons as a rule, but when the available other spaces are already occupied by more photons, then the rule is they crash, and there is an interaction between the electron and the photon. But anyway, that's a relatively subtle issue. So anyway, that's what I'm working on. So I do have to begin with the initial proposition, which is the energy is photons, that all matter is photons trapped in arrangements, mechanically rigid arrangements. So there is no forces, there are no magic grips on things, that the only grips are probably something physical that has to physically impact something else. Which had me also thinking about electrons and the fact that light is, you really can't change light's direction with a magnet, but you can affect the direction of an electron very easily with a magnet. And so there's an argument to be made, why is one so susceptible to that movement, and why is one not susceptible? And that would be what this explanation is for. is that photons are too small to be affected by photons. The photons just go around each other. But if the photons are in the arrangement of an electron, then they will affect each other because it cannot go around. It cannot evade. So that's why electrons are affected. Is just that they have a mass now because they're more than one photon, and they negate the rule of avoidance. And there is an impact instead of a avoidance. Yeah, good enough, I think, for now. So it lots to work with here, obviously. But yeah, I like this restructuring of the model. You know, we have facts, and now we have to build models of what these things are to fit the facts. And I just think the model they have, where they're thinking the quanta and the photon have the quanta in the, the quantum effects are in the photons, is a fundamental mistake. The quantum complexity is in the complex relationship of the electron, and quite obviously, even just by appearance, you can see the wave-like property of a structure like a DNA molecule. I mean, it creates it visually right in front of your eyes. And so that's where the probability wave is coming from, is the complexity of the arrangement of the electron. It's not in the nature of a photon. And so entanglement can't work. Doesn't work. It isn't real. So anyway, till next time.